Hey everyone, and welcome to our December live event for National Quilter Circle. Once again, we have Susan Guzman here to answer all your quilting questions. So Susan, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, you bet. Hi, everybody.
So I'm going to start off with a festive question just because we were just talking about Christmas trees prior to going live. But what are you sewing for Christmas and who are you sewing it for?
Oh gosh. You know what? I'm actually working on a table runner that I started a couple of months ago, but I just never finished it for my mom. Um, I'm using some fabrics that I collected when I used to live in Indiana, and they all go together really beautifully. They're Moda, like a variety of Moda lines, and it's actually in the shape of sort of like big flowers. And
Nice.
yeah, and they're applique.
Perfect. Okay, well, speaking of applique, I'm going to ask you a question about that in a minute, but I want to remind anybody, if this is their first time tuning in watching this, or even if you've watched these for years now, it feels like, you can always ask your questions live for the next hour. You can do that by just typing them into the chat box, and they will pop up, and we'll be able to answer as many of them as we can over the next hour. But in terms of applique, do you do raw edge applique or turned edge?
I like turned edge. I mean, if I have a preference, I prefer turned edge, but I do raw edge as well.
Do you have any tips for doing turned edge to where you don't burn your fingers with a giant iron while trying to turn those edges?
Well, oh, there are different techniques that are out there. And like, for instance, some people use glue to put the edge over whatever your base is. So, for instance, there's actually this sort of woven material that I've been using recently that has a sticky side to it, or I guess I should say a glue side to it. And what you do is you wrap the fabric around that, and you can just iron the very edge of the turned under 1/4 inch seam on the back side. So that's one thing that you can use.
Do you, because I guess the only way I've ever done it is I usually have a template shape that I've already cut out from, say, like that Mylar no melt template plastic. And so you can sort of press right along the edge of that.
Yeah, that's another way of doing it. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that you can do hand applique. Yeah, I would say for the most part, people typically use some sort of a template.
Yeah, I'm not good enough to just freehand. And you mentioned hand applique. I guess I always stitch it by machine. I'm always in a hurry to get it done, so I always use machine applique. But hand applique is, do you do just a blanket stitch around the outside edge, or what do you do for your hand applique?
No, I actually do like a blind stitch. You sort of come up from the back side and you poke out from the center of whatever your shape is. You sort of poke your needle out along the very edge of whatever your shape is. And then you end up pulling your thread out, and then you almost go underneath that shape to poke it back down through. And you just do that all the way around.
Perfect. Just because, it's about 5 minutes in and I have to plug a video already, but we have a video on National Quilter Circle on how to do an invisible stitch similar to that. This instructor is actually showing it. That's the stitch that she uses to hand stitch her bindings in place along a quilt. So you can always, multi-purpose stitch, use it in a couple different areas. So check that video out if you want to do either binding on your quilts or hand applique. But speaking of your table runner that you're making, if you have seen on Facebook or on Instagram, we're doing a 12 days of paper piecing table runner project right now. So in terms of paper piecing, do you have any tips for us for paper piecing?
So you're speaking of foundation paper piecing?
Yes.
Well, one thing that I like to do is I run all of my paper piecing on my regular paper through my printer. But there are papers out there specifically for foundation paper piecing that are really thin. So you can use those. Another thing is, if you're using regular copy paper, you want to be able to take your stitch length down, like make it very tight, so that when you go to tear the paper off the back, it tears really simply. So there's a couple of tips there for you.
If you use that other paper, because I do the same thing. I always when I decide I want to do a paper piecing project, I don't always have the special paper, so I do just print it on my regular paper. If you're using that special paper, do you still have to adjust your stitch length, or can you leave it, say, at a 2.5 or whatever your standard machine stitch length is?
You can, yeah. I mean, I don't think you really necessarily need to adjust it. It's really just mainly for that thicker paper, that comes with your copy machine.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And now, if somebody is not familiar with paper piecing in general, whether it's foundation paper piecing or English paper piecing is another different type, can you kind of explain the difference between the two and how you can not get them confused?
Foundation paper piecing is, like we were saying, typically you get your patterns just run off of your printer.
Mm-hmm.
And foundation paper piecing is actually taking shapes. I actually have some here. Say, like, if you would do a hexagon, what I do is I've for a project that I'm working on right now, I'm doing these oversized hexagons. And what you do is you take the paper template. You can buy templates as well in bulk. And that kind of cuts down on time and your time and effort of running them off yourself. But I'm kind of thrifty, and so I like to do that. And I do use a heavier paper anyway in my copy machine. Excuse me, because I print all my patterns on demand. So I use a higher quality paper. So it's always like a pretty nice weight to my paper template itself. And so they're pretty easy to work with. But essentially what I do is I take just a tab larger, so a 1/4 inch larger, the same shape. So I would use a hexagon that was a 1/4 inch larger than this one. Mm-hmm. And then what I do is I actually trace it. Can you see the trace marks on this?
Oh,
yeah. This is the wrong side of the fabric. I just traced the larger one. And then what you do from there is you take your template that you have. This is oversized, so I apologize. But just essentially this, it wouldn't be that thick. You just fold this down, and you just start doing a really loose stitch all the way around the edge until you go all the way around. And then your actual piece will look like this. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this fabric is a little oversized. I haven't worked on this project in a while, and it's a little, the seam allowance I gave it was pretty thick.
But is that okay? Can you have a larger seam allowance?
Absolutely. Yeah, you definitely can. And then what you do when you go to piece these together, let's say you want them side by side like this. Mm-hmm. You put right sides together, and then that edge that you want to meet, you end up just whip stitching all along this edge, and that it ends up being connected right there. Okay, and then you just continue to add. I just had it here. Oh, here we go. So for instance, this one that I did before, I still have, can you still see the whip stitch?
Just barely, yep.
Yeah, just a little bit. I'll leave that in until I have everything finished, but you can still, I still have the paper in. And in order to take that out, you just take those stitches out, and they're just super easy to take out, because they're just really big whip stitch, or really big basting stitches. I'm sorry.
So then, is there a way to piece together your pieces without stitching through the paper to make them easier to remove? I'm thinking of ways to streamline it. I've done it a little bit, but not as much as you have. So
you can actually use glue. There are glues that you can use. I've just always done it this way. This is how I was taught, or how I taught myself to do it, in whatever book I saw, or maybe it was online. I don't remember. It's been so long. But yeah, that's how I do it. So,
gotcha.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking if there's a way that you could glue it and not stitch it, then maybe you could reuse some of those pieces if you carefully pulled them out.
Well,
And,
you can still reuse them actually just by gently taking the threads out.
Oh, okay.
You just want to snip like the, like snip one of these large, can you see it real well?
Yeah.
Yeah, you just want to snip that and it'll just pull right out. And then your paper hexagon, you can reuse that if you wish.
Gotcha.
And, I mean, they encourage you to do that, like the company that makes the heavier paper templates.
Yep. Okay, so you make all of these little tiny hexagons, and then what is the general design that you normally do with them? Do you always just sort of put them together to make one just big square, rectangle, whatever you get to, or how do you normally design with hexagons?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can do anything. Like, for instance, and I should have brought the big one, but essentially what I'm doing with this design, and it was something actually, I saw someone on Facebook. They had a hexagon quilt draped over a chair, and I thought, oh my God, that's so cool. I love it. And I love all of the K facet, the real saturated color fabrics. So what I did was, like, for instance, this one, I don't remember, I'll have to go back and look, but I believe I was going to put this fabric around, then hexagons all the way around this one. And then outside of that fabric, I am going to put this. Okay, so it's going to be an oversized diamond. Okay, so it'll have 3 layers. And it's pretty cool. I mean, they're pretty big. I think they're like 20 some inches tall.
Jeez.
And then what I'm going to do is, in between for sashing, I'm using K facet. What is it called? The cotton. Oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank. But anyway, it's cotton fabric, and it sort of looks like denim. So it's like this sort of dark, but like dark denim.
Yeah.
And it's going to sort of offset like all this real bright fabric. So it'll be fun. I'm excited to get it.
It looks like it would be a lot of fun. My grandma came to visit a while ago, and she's working on it. She has a little, I'm going to call it a tackle box, and she has little layers in it, and that's where she keeps. The bottom is the one she's already pieced, and then the next one is the pre-cut squares of fabric she's using, and then she has all of them. She just takes it apart and then works on it and puts it back together. So I think it could be fun and relaxing if you're into hand sewing. That could be a way to sort of get into hand sewing. So you had really like perfectly cut pieces that you were tracing onto. I'm just looking at, this is a scrap pile I have going from a project. Can you use just scrap? I mean,
you sure can. Yeah, you definitely can. And the backs don't have to be perfect. I mean, you can. I've seen where people just use scraps like that, and they don't take the time to really trim that out. You really don't need to. It does make your quilt top a little bit heavier, though. Just keep that in mind. But you really don't need to do that.
In tradition, I guess, I don't know how far back English paper piecing goes here. Since you're hand stitching all of that, do you normally hand quilt that, or then would you still machine quilt that? Does it sort of take away from it at all if you machine quilt a hand stitched English paper piecing?
I don't think it takes away from it, but personally, I am going to hand quilt it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How? Okay. Every time you say something, I think of another question, because I honestly have never hand quilted something. So I kind of want to know your process of how you even go about hand quilting. Do you have to baste it differently? How do you do that?
Well, this will be my first hand quilting project. I took a class, actually. That's probably the only quilting class that I ever took, was in the actual act of hand quilting. And what you need to do is get some sort of
a frame, right?
Yeah, like a frame. Yeah, there's different kinds though. I mean, you can even use like a like embroidery, like, yeah, you can get just a small one. They do come larger though. There are quilting ones that come fairly large. And so that's what you'll use. And you just get a heavier thread. I would get at least 40 weight. You can even do a 30 weight thread. And just whatever your design is, it just depends on how you want to do it. But there are a variety of ways of putting patterns on, I'm actually just going to echo quilt mine around each of the hexagons on the inside of each one. So that's what I'm going to end up doing.
I can't wait to see it when it's done. You'll definitely have to keep us updated and post pictures and like progress pictures of you with your giant frame quilting. I just think that's going to be so fun.
Right.
So, I just want to remind anybody, because we can see we have some viewers, if you have any questions, definitely go ahead and type those in the chat box and we will answer those. Also, comments too. I'd love to know if anybody has done either English paper piecing or foundation paper piecing and if they enjoy it or not.
Yeah, that would be great to know.
Yeah. Moving on, a couple other questions here. Want to kind of know, what is your design process in terms of how you design a quilt, sort of start to finish?
Okay.
What does it look like for you?
Okay. Actually, what I typically do is, it depends on what the project is, but let's say I'm doing a project and I want to just do a bunch of different blocks. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll go through, and I think I've shown it before. I apologize. I should have brought it over here, but Barbara Brackman has a book on quilt block patterns, and they're not by any means, it's a book of just pictures. It doesn't actually tell you how to piece everything together. But for instance, this project that I did here, I just sketched out different blocks that I like. And I just sketched them out, and I thought, I'll go ahead and choose which ones look good together. And once I decide that, then I actually, and not all the time, I don't always do this, but I might then hand sketch it out on graph paper. And then from there, if I don't do the sketching on graph paper of the layout, and I already have in mind what I want to do, then I just go to Electric Quilt, my EQ program, and I just recreate the blocks in the EQ program, and then I set them up that way. And then I pull in my digital fabrics and plug everything in. Then once I have that all figured out, like the design that I want, what I do from there is I then calculate the fabric that I need, because I need to order it from the fabric company. So for instance, this project that I'm working on right now, what I did was I just listed out all of the different parts and pieces of each individual fabric throughout the whole quilt top. You have to go through and look at your entire design and see where that, like this first fabric is used, and just calculate out how much fabric you need. So it's a pretty intensive process as far as that's concerned. And then once I get that done, then what I do is by that time I usually get the fabric in the mail from the manufacturer, and I'll make the quilt, and I'll take notes on all of those little notes that I have here. I'll take notes here, and I'll just make sure that I did it. I calculated the fabric out correctly. I usually order a little bit extra just in case for a fudge factor.
Right.
And after I have that all done, then what I do is I sketch out all of the illustrations, because I do my own illustrations. And I sketch all of those out. So like this one says block 6. And these are all the illustrations that I will create to then plug into my pattern. And then I actually do the pattern writing based off of my illustrations.
Your note taking is immaculate, and like I'm pretty sure, because I have a not even similar process. Mine is just like chicken scratch and like little drawings that if anyone else saw them, I think I took a picture and sent one to my mom once because she wanted to know how to make something that I was making, and I was like, I hope you understand this, that's how it comes together. So it's kind of cool to see that there can be totally different approaches to how you get to your final decision.
Yeah.
In terms of your first sketches, because all of it looks like it's just in pencil, how do you decide colors? You mentioned using your EQ program, but if you didn't have that, like how do you pick colors?
Well, like how I sketch out like all the dark spots, I just know that I want to use whatever the shape of each block is. I want to use a darker fabric, a darker contrasted fabric in those spaces. And then the background can be like a light print, like a mini print, light mini print. I always like a lot of texture. So when I go to plug it into my, or recreate each of the blocks in EQ, that's where I get to play with the colors, you know, of a collection, and then decide what I want where.
Gotcha. I like it. I think I'm gonna have to invest in some graph paper and just like sit and start sketching that, because that looks really fun. Because right now I just kind of like randomly sketch it all in the EQ program. And so if you look through my design files, there's like 100 of nope, didn't like that, didn't like that, didn't like that. It'd be so much easier to just be able to wad up a piece of paper, throw it away.
You know what? This is my favorite sketch pad.
Yeah.
It's Cambridge. And I just recently bought a bunch of them. I bought like, I don't know, 7 or 10 of them off of Amazon. And I love this. And I have stacks and stacks of these that are filled. I haven't been doing as much sketching over the past probably couple of years as I used to, but I was a voracious sketcher, and I have so many designs. I've got like a stack of these, like about this high.
Yep. See, I'm taking notes here as we're talking about all the things I'm going to try later on, probably like this week.
It is fun.
Yeah. Our next question here, this comes in from Rosie, and she says she's a beginner in quilting and wants to know, what is the best type of thread to use for basic quilting?
Basic quilting, when you're piecing together, what you want to do is have a 100% cotton thread, and I would use 50 weight. You can use 50 or 40. The higher the number, the thinner the thread. So 40 does work. 40 also is a good weight to use to quilt all your layers together. So that's what I would recommend.
Perfect. And because I think we mentioned this once before and it was a new product, I think you're the one that told me about it. And if not, I might be throwing you off a little bit here, but I believe it's with Arafil, but we were talking about appliquing earlier. Don't they have a new thread to use for appliquing? What would you use for that? Just to kind of go full circle here.
Actually, they came out with an 80 weight, which is super duper thin. And you just do not see that. I've never had a problem with 50 weight using that. But when you use the 80 weight, it just like pretty much completely disappears when you do any of the hand applique.
Do you have to worry about it breaking because it's so thin? Like, is it really, really, I don't want to say frail, but you know?
I haven't had any problems with it.
If you were English paper piecing, what would you use for that? Because you don't really want to see those stitches either, right? When you're putting them together.
Yeah. I've been using 50 with this. It's an older project, but you could definitely use 80 with that as well.
Perfect. I'm gonna have to get some of that and try it. See,
yeah, definitely.
All right, next question here. This is from Marcia. I'm just getting started quilting. I am on my second quilt, which is a log cabin style. I was wondering if you have any tips for someone who is just getting started quilting.
I would say when you make a log cabin quilt, you want to definitely be organized. And I've had friends who take paper plates and they organize all of their fabrics that way, like in the order that they're going to be using them. So if you're making a scrappy log cabin quilt, you know, you might have like a variety of fabrics, but the same size on one plate. And then the next largest size on the next plate, and so on. So that's one way that you can, you know, stay a little bit more organized.
Well, can you, without having to make you sketch it on your sketch pad, can you kind of describe what a log cabin quilt is and how it comes together, and where you normally place your colors too?
Traditionally, a log cabin quilt starts with a square in the center. Let's just say a 1 inch by 1 inch square. And traditionally, that square is red because that is the heart of the home. That represents the heart of the home.
I didn't know that.
So what you end up doing is, so that 1 inch square finished, you cut that square 1.5 inches. Okay. Your first strip, let's say you want your strips to be 1 inch wide. that first strip is going to be 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch square that you attach to that square. So you have two, let's just say you're doing the traditional red, and then you would have your next fabric, let's say on top. So those two squares would be the same size. Then what you do is you go to the next side, which is the long side here. And so that would be 2 inches, and then you always add 1/2 inch. So that would be your next size that you add on. Then on the bottom, because you want to go around, let's see, I guess that would be clockwise from your side, right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, clockwise. Yep. Yeah, counterclockwise from my end. But then, so you have that 1 inch, and then you have the other 1 inch strip. So that's 2 inches wide. So 2 inches long of a strip by 1 inch. So what you would cut that fabric at would be 2.5 by 1.5 inches. And you just keep going around. And graph paper is really great for that, because each one of those little squares, just count that as 1 inch, or count it as, I typically count those squares as 2 inches, because I make a lot of quilt designs based off of 2.5 inch squares. So it's really a lot of fun just to do your own designing like that too.
Just because you mentioned, we learned something about the tradition of a log cabin. I didn't know that about the center being red. If you had to pick your favorite traditional block, or say classic block, what would it be?
Oh gosh. Oh, that's a really good question.
You can think about it and get back to us.
Maybe a pinwheel. I really like the pinwheel. It's pretty basic, but you can do a lot with it.
That's funny. My mom just got into quilting. I think you helped get her into quilting too by doing the challenges. Pinwheels. So I think that's funny. So she doesn't like pinwheels because of how it's hard to get the center, right? The back, nothing ever lines up. So when you're sewing a pinwheel, what are tips on how to get all of your points, in the center to line up? And then how can you even press them flat, sort of without a demonstration? Just what are some tips for sewing pinwheels?
Well, when you're bringing so many different points together into the center, so you want to be very careful about your pressing. So you want all of your pressing to sort of lock into each one when you go to piece those patches together. So that would be one thing. And then another thing is there's a couple of different ways that you can treat that center. There's a way to sort of open up the spiral of that center and press it flat. You can also press those seams open, like when you're joining. So a pinwheel consists of 4 different half square triangle patches. When you join your top row to your bottom row, you can go ahead and press that open. And when you do your pressing, I recommend to press, if you're pressing it open, to then press on the top of your block as well. That way it just sort of opens up all of those seams really well. But you also want to set your seams. You always want to set your seams. And what that means is when you have 2 pieces of fabric together that you just sewed those 2 pieces together, you want to take your iron, and before you open that up to press it open, you want to press that seam, and that's called setting your seam.
There's one thing I say a lot every time. I've been doing some videos going along with the challenge that we're doing right now, and that's one thing that I say all the time. And we even had a couple of people commenting that they feel like that I'm there watching them as they're pressing, like they can hear me saying, set the seam, set the seam. So I'm very repetitive in that. But yes, I definitely agree. Very, very important. Our next question here, this is from Joan. When sewing, my stitches come out inconsistent. What can I do to fix that?
Okay, and when you say inconsistent, I'm kind of assuming that maybe your 1/4 inch seam doesn't always end up being a 1/4 inch seam. And what you can do, wouldn't you say that, Ashley?
Yeah, let's address that, and then also maybe some skip stitches or those kind of stitch issues too. So we'll kind of address both of those.
Okay, so if you're sewing along and you're having issues with your 1/4 inch seam allowance, there are a couple of different things that you can do with that. And first of all, just very basically, you can draw a 1/4 inch seam line with a pencil, just a number 2 pencil's fine, on the wrong side of the top fabric, and you can use that. There's also different things that you can put on the base of your sewing machine that help you with a 1/4 inch seam. There are 1/4 inch seam feet as well for your sewing machine, so you can use those. And then if you're like using a brand new machine and you're not really used to the 1/4 inch seam allowance and you're having issues, what I recommend is that you do a test and just take 3 different strips of fabrics that are 1.5 by 3.5, sew those all together, and you can kind of, judge, like, sew the first 2 together. When you go to open that up, that piece should be 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches, that joined pieces. And then if that's okay, then join your next one. And you can kind of find out where your issues can be there as well.
Perfect. So that would be if it's the seam allowance issue, but I mean, if it's if her question is intending stitch quality issues instead, sort of what are some of those and how do you fix those?
Yeah, so like you had mentioned, if you happen to get like a skip stitch, a lot of times it's just replacing your needle. That's basically what it is. Another thing that you can do is clean out your, you know how you come with, your sewing machine comes with all these little brushes and whatnot, and like a little screwdriver. Just take your face plate off, and you can take that little brush and brush around your bobbin case. And then also, like mine, where I put my bobbin in is sort of down under on the side. A lot of times I get a lot of accumulation there of fibers. And then also in your feed dogs, you get a lot of fibers. So all of those fibers can kind of mess up stitches as well. But that's what I would recommend.
Absolutely. And I definitely, back to you're saying, take apart your machine. I don't want to say take apart your machine, but take a couple pieces off so you can see down into your machine. That's one thing that I think intimidates a lot of people, and they don't do because they're afraid they're not going to be able to get their machine back together. But I mean, it's really as simple as a couple screws, and don't be afraid to do it, right? Like,
yeah, I would say if you're mechanical, go for it. If you're not mechanical, and the other thing is you really have to be careful about electronic machines. About getting like too much into that sort of thing. But if it's really basic, you're having skip stitches, try that first, like just doing the bobbin case, cleaning that all out. And with some machines, there's like a piece that fits down in where the bobbin sits. Like the bobbin will fit into a piece that actually is movable, and you can actually lift that out too and clean that out. I wouldn't, if you have an expensive machine though, I wouldn't like recommend to do anything more than that. I would recommend that you go in and take it in to have it cleaned professionally. And I would say if you do a lot of sewing, you really should take your machine in once a year. I know that's how, yeah.
I'm making that face because I've never actually taken the machine in that I use all the time. It's been in pretty much every video I've ever done. It was the machine I bought for like $100 at a Walmart in Fairbanks, Alaska when I was in college. Like it's just a harding machine, and I've never taken it in. So I mean, I don't want to say some machines are more finicky than others, but you may find that yours requires more attention or in-depth care than others. But I was reaching over here. I'm taking the throat plate off. I was going to show the one little bobbin area in a second, but while I'm doing that, Rosie has another question here, which you addressed this a little bit earlier, but you can kind of touch on it again. She says that this is the first time doing an applique, and she sees different videos, some saying to tuck the raw edge under and some just to sew over the raw edge. She wants to know what you recommend and what is the best type of stitch to use on the edge. So I would say both, go ahead and say both a hand stitch and a machine stitch too.
Oh, okay. I would say that as far as hand appliquing, really it's best to do a blind stitch. That's what I prefer to do. As far as like what my preference is, whether I do raw edge or I do the turned edge applique, I prefer turned edge just because I personally like that look. But that doesn't mean that that's all I do. I do raw edge as well. And when I do raw edge, I use the, oh gosh, eh, forgive me, I'm drawing a blank on what it's called, but it's the, you can go to like Joann's and they have this paperback fusible, I'm sorry, paperback fusible web that it's essentially glue. It's like a webbed glue. And you first iron on the paper side, you iron the web side to the back of your fabric. And then you can either cut your shape out ahead of time from that paperback fusible and iron it right to the back of your fabric to the wrong side, or you can iron the fusible to your fabric, just like a sheet of it or whatever if you're doing a lot, and then you can cut out your shapes from there. A lot of times people get confused because if you're using templates and you're using raw edge, you want to flip those templates over. So you're doing the flipped side of it so that when you go to applique it to your base fabric, it's going to be right side up, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. And I'm reaching under here because this is, when you were trying to describe what it was, I was also blanking on the term because fusible web, it's what I call it, or wonder under sometimes is what I call it.
Wonder under's a good, yeah.
I don't even know how people did raw edge up without it. It's like but I buy it in bolts. And so I have part of it here just to give you an idea.
Yeah.
In really big sheets. But I was going to try and show what you're talking about. There's one side that has some glue. So I don't know if you can see that it's shining a little bit. And then and you're saying you're drawing your template on the paper side, and that's why it has to be reversed. Otherwise.
You know, one thing about fusible is it does go bad.
Really?
Yeah, it actually does.
I guess I've never kept it long enough.
Yeah.
But I use it up too quick.
I think I was drawing a blank on it because I don't use it a whole lot. But it really is a wonderful product, but it does go bad. I would say if you've had it for longer than a year, and a good thing to do is just jot down the date in pencil in one of the corners and like make that the last corner that you end up using. That way, you know that if it's you know, like over a year old or getting pretty close, you might want to buy some new.
How do you know if it's gone bad? Like, what if
it actually starts separating from the paper? From the paperback, yeah. And it just it just doesn't work as nicely.
Really, but it's still.
Well, have you break down like the webbing itself breaks down?
Gotcha. Have you ever had any issues with it? Say like if you've fused it in place and then laundered whatever it is you've stitched, having it pull away if it's old, is that kind of another sign?
Well, you mean like after the piece has been made? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, like the maybe the fusible is just not staying fused.
I mean, for the most part, it's just used to be able to do your raw edge stitching. So it will, from what I remember, and I apologize, I just haven't used it in a while, but from what I remember, it does wash out. So
I think you can get different kinds. I think there are some that do wash out, and honestly, I guess some of the times that I've used it in projects where I've used it in place, there's really no way for me to know whether it's still there or not, right? Because it's between the layers. So it could have washed out. It could still be there.
You know what? I just don't think about it after it's done. Yeah, I just don't even. But it does become, I mean, once you launder, it becomes much more flexible. You know, how it's kind of stiff when you use it. And your actual block is kind of stiff. It's because of that glue. But that does, from what I remember, that does wash out.
Perfect. So I just want to remind anyone that we still have about 20 more minutes to answer some more questions. If anyone has any more questions, just enter those into the chat box. It's either next to or below the video you're watching now. But just because I was tinkering with it over here, I wanted to show you how simple and easy it can be to take apart your machine to a certain extent to do some cleaning, because I was multitasking doing it. It's just two pieces that come off. It's two little screws that came out of these little holes here. So this is the plastic part that just covers my bobbin case. So you mentioned that your machine, the bobbin comes in on the front, or mine's a top load. So mine comes right here at the top. But then these two pieces just come right off. And then I can see, I'm going to show this to you. It's very dirty, so don't judge me. But can see down in here. It's really easy to sort of just see down into it. And you can just, like you said, take your little brush and just kind of get all that lint out. And then you mentioned the little bobbin case piece that comes out.
Yeah.
So your bobbin sits down in here, right, when you're sewing, and it just comes right out. And this is probably when I took mine apart for the first time, what intimidated me the most, because I didn't know how this goes back in. But the great thing about them is they can only go in one way. So you just sort of put it, I'm going to pretend this is my machine, but you put it down in your machine and you just spin it and it'll just drop right into place. So you can't put that in wrong. Like there's only one way that it can go in. So can't stress it enough. Don't be afraid of your machine. Take it apart, clean it.
Yeah, definitely.
Lisa asks, she is a brand new owner of a mid-arm quilting machine. She's done some practicing and she wants to quilt her first pieced quilt on it. Do I start to quilt in the center like I used to do with my domestic machine? Or since this is all loaded on my quilting frame with the floating batting on top, do I just start at the top center, or where should she start?
That's an excellent question, and I am not qualified to answer that. I feel badly, but I don't know for sure. What I would recommend is to call your dealer and ask them how they recommend it. I believe because you pull everything so taut, your quilt on the frame. And then you roll it so that you can get your machine in there. It's my understanding that that's so taut that you can pretty much go anywhere. But I'm really not qualified to answer that. I don't want you to mess up your quilt.
No, I feel like depending on where you got your mid-arm machine, lots of places have, the instructional tutorials, or, sometimes they come with CDs, or everybody has websites nowadays where I'm sure there's some videos on that as well. But I second your initial thought, though, that because it's on the frame and it is pulled tight, and that's part of, I would say, a luxury of using those machines, is that you get to sort of start and work your way as you're rolling and moving down the quilt. So that makes it a little bit different than, if you're trying to just hold your entire quilt that you've just basted and get it onto your domestic machine. But definitely, like you said, check with the manufacturer with that. You, I know, do your own designing and pattern writing and piecing. Don't necessarily like to do a lot of your own quilting. However, if you were going to, would you long arm? Would you mid arm? Would you use your domestic machine? What would you play around?
I mean, when I do it, I use my domestic machine, and my domestic machine has a very large throat area. I think it's 9 inches. So I have like a lot of room there. And you can quilt even a king size quilt on your domestic machine. It can be cumbersome, but with a lot of rolling that goes underneath that throat, you can do sections there. And I would recommend that if you are doing it on your domestic machine, to start in the center if you're able to. Another thing to do is to start in the center and just stitch in the ditch, and then go back and do all your fancy work if you wish, because that really stabilizes. It stabilizes your entire quilt top, and then you can start anywhere you want because everything's already, you won't have a lot of shifting around.
Right. And that is one thing. We have another instructor that does a lot of videos for us on National Quilter Circle, ZJ Humbach, who is a professional long arm quilter. And one thing that she mentioned that she does for people, which I guess I never even thought of as an option, but say you want to quilt your own quilt, but you're worried that things are going to shift, or you just want to make sure that it's basted nice. You can send your quilt top, your batting, and your backing to a long arm quilter and have them just stitch 6-inch, 9-inch, just grid lines, just basting stitches, and they can base that all together, and then you can do all your quilting and then take that off. So especially, like you mentioned, if you're trying to do it on your domestic machine and you're rolling it and you don't want, pins that you might accidentally grab, like that's a thing that I didn't know that you could do, but is an awesome idea to have them base it for you.
Yeah, definitely.
Perfect. We've talked about this a little bit in the past before, but if somebody maybe is not necessarily wanting to quilt their own quilt, they want to have someone quilt it for them, but they don't know anybody that quilts. How do you find a person to quilt your quilts?
I think word of mouth is really great. That's probably I think your best bet if you know other quilters. The other thing is contact your local quilt shop. Sometimes they do it right there at the quilt shop, or they work with somebody who will come and pick up your quilts and then drop them back off at the shop, and then that's where you pick it up and drop it off from. So that's another way that you can do. Also, do a Google search. And the only thing with that is, you don't know the person. Social media is another way. If there's somebody who has a lot of followers and they are a quilter, long arm quilter, that's another way to find people.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna agree with your word of mouth suggestion, because you are the one that introduced me to the person who long arm quilts all my quilts, and I absolutely love her, and I would never use anyone else now. So definitely always good to have sort of the personal recommendation from someone, and then they can kind of give you an idea too, as you did with me. How do you prepare your quilt before you send it to your long arm quilter? Do you have to do anything in terms of trimming it up or cleaning it up before you send it to them?
Yeah, it is. If you're especially if you're a new quilter, it's good to have your quilt squared up. You want to make sure your quilt is square. And then in addition to that, all of the threads that end up on the back, because you're just moving that around so much by adding borders, by first piecing all the blocks together, all those raw edges get rubbed, so you have like a lot of those flyaway pieces from the fabric, and you want to trim all those as best you can, especially because you don't want to see like a dark thread behind a white fabric, and that can happen.
I've done that. It was a bummer, but I've done that, because you don't think about it. You don't think about how many of all those little threads there are going to be. And I'm always focused on what the front of it looks like. I never really look at the back. So it's definitely something to take into consideration. Do you baste the edge of your quilt? Some people I know baste the entire perimeter of their quilt, because those seams, there's no back stitching when you're piecing. Is that something that you do?
I don't. No, I've never done it. I've never had anybody ask me to do it either.
Well,
is that what you do?
I've only done, I did some smaller baby quilts that were out of fleece, and I did with those. I just felt like the edges looked like they were pulling, like I could start to see the stitches just a little bit. So, yeah.
Well, are you talking about the quilt top, just the top, or are you talking about the sandwich?
Just the quilt top before I sent it to the quilt.
Okay. Yeah, no, I don't. I don't. But if you're quilting a quilt, you do want to baste around the entire outside edge. Make sure you do that before you start your quilting. Does that make sense?
Yes. I guess I've never done that, because I'm always afraid that I haven't, pulled it tight enough when I'm basting my layers, or, pinning my layers together, and then I want to be able to account for that possible shift. So if I've basted, how do I, if I need to move it out?
Once you baste your entire quilt, then go around that edge, because you want to make sure that you don't get any waviness on the edge. And you're not doing it like real tight stitches. You're doing, wider basting stitches around the edge.
Gotcha. Perfect. All right, our next question that just came in here. I'm wanting to start using rulers for quilting to give myself a new skill. What do you suggest is good for a newbie?
As far as, using for the quilting process. I'm
going to assume that too, but then we'll also go ahead and talk about just your favorite rulers too.
Oh, okay. Yeah. The rulers work really well. I personally don't use them. I usually do just freehand. I don't like stippling, or you can do like pebbling circles, quilting that way. But I've heard that people just absolutely love the rulers, and they work really, really well.
I feel like if I ever got into long arm quilting, I would probably be the person that would use rulers, because I I need it to be a straight line. It needs, you know, so I would want to have the ruler. So I know there's a couple things. If you are going to use a ruler, there are like ruler feet you can buy for your machine that actually fit up against those rulers a little better, make it a little bit easier. Somebody who did a previous challenge for us, the one right before the one that you did, Gina, I'm blanking on her new last name because she just got married, but she runs the Copper Needle, and she does a lot of lawn quilting. She has her own website of all sorts of rulers that she's designed, and she has tutorials that show you how to actually use them too. So if you want, you know, the whole package of where do you get the ruler, what kind of ruler, and her showing you how to use them, it's the Copper Needle is her shop.
Yeah, and then also sewing machine companies, the long arm machine companies also sell rulers, like Handy Quilter. I know that they sell rulers.
Okay, so those are rulers for quilting. Now let's talk about what's your favorite ruler for, you know, piecing and measuring and cutting.
Well, my basic ruler that I love is a 6-inch by 24-inch ruler. And I've used that with my 24-inch by 36-inch cutting mat. And those are my staples. I mean, I don't do any quilting without those two pieces.
So I agree with you on the mat. And I used to say I used to have a smaller one. I think I had the 18 by 24, and that's just the only one I ever had. And I didn't realize sort of how much I was missing out until I got the big one. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. But so I have the bigger ruler. It's out of my reach. But this is the one I end up using more than anything else. And mine's so 2.5 by 18 is sort of my go-to favorite one. Of course, unless I'm cutting with the fabric strips, but this is definitely my favorite. And then I always use Omni Grip. What do you use?
I use Omni Grip as well. And I just love how, I mean, it really does help with the like less sliding. And I'll tell you, the reason why I like the 6-inch by 24-inch is I don't get as much slide. I get more sliding personally with a smaller ruler, but everybody, you know, it works differently for everyone.
That's true.
But I like putting my whole hand on that roller so I know it's really not going to shift.
That's right. So that's like the opposite. We're like the opposite person. That's like the opposite technique that I use, because that's why I like the thinner ruler, is because I like to, if I'm my cutting mat, right, and my ruler's on my cutting mat, I like to have like half of my hand off to the side, because I know that I'm pushing against it sort of with my rotary cutter. And so I have my hand off the ruler so it can't slip. So that's kind of my, I guess I don't have the finger span to go off the edge of the 6.5 or 6-inch ruler. So that's sort of my random little technique, I guess, to keep it from sliding.
And that's just it. Yeah, that works for you. And that other, the other one just works better for me. It's just something that I've used from day one.
Yeah, I think
you know, we're talking about rulers, and one other ruler that I think is really great to have for newer people is a 12.5 by 12.5-inch square. That's a great one because you can trim up squares, you know, any size up to 12.5 inches, which is really nice and handy to have.
That is like the only size of square that I don't have. Which I'm going to show you what my new favorite little square has become, and you're going to laugh, but it's this little teeny tiny.
Oh, I love that one.
Piece, because you even mentioned you do a lot with 2.5-inch squares, and it's just a super easy one to use. It's very easy to hold, because it's, I mean, you put your whole hand over it, you're not going to obviously watch your fingers, but so yeah, they come in all different sizes. Have you ever used, I know you're not a gadget person per se, but do you use specialty rulers?
I don't. No, I don't. Do you?
I've recently started using block lock rulers, and I absolutely love them. So they are just a square ruler, or they have a bunch of other, depending on different specialty blocks that you're doing. But say you're doing half square triangles, it's just it's your square ruler, but it has a groove in the middle that just locks on that seam, and it's just, I mean, it's super quick. So that's sort of my new go-to specialty ruler.
Yeah, and there are some really, really awesome rulers out there. You know, even for like flying geese, there's like specialty rulers for flying geese, and there's all sorts of really neat things out there. I just personally have never gotten into doing that.
So I feel like there's sort of been this, I'm sure over the past years and years, like prior to both of us as well. But so this evolution of quilting to where, you know, now we have all these specialty tools and specialty rulers and specialty feet and all these things. And if you think back to the people who probably made the first quilts, what do you think they would think of all of our new toys?
They probably would think that we're spoiled.
I agree.
What do you think?
Probably, yeah. So we probably have time for a couple more questions. If anyone has any last minute questions they want to get in, we can answer at least a couple more. But I'm going to continue on our little talk here about rulers and specialty tools and things like that. You mentioned that you don't use a lot of them, but if you are somebody who's just getting into quilting and you are, you know, standing in the quilt shop and you're overwhelmed by the hundreds of specialty things you can buy, what do you need? What should you, you know, avoid, maybe save for later? What can you get by without? You know, what would you start with in terms of your purchases for starting in quilting?
Yeah, you just basically need a good sized cutting mat. You want to have a table as well that is at least waist high. That's just, and I shouldn't say at least, but like pretty close to your waist, because otherwise you're going to kill your back. You can really damage your back, and you have to just make sure that you have a surface that's up high enough where you're not leaning over your table so much. So that's what I would recommend. And to start out for a reasonable price, Joann's has a folding table. It's not super sturdy, but it has the legs that come out, and it's a pretty good sized table. That's actually what I use. I probably need a new one now from our last move. I've kind of jerry-rigged one of the legs, but basically that's what I use. And it's pretty reasonable. I don't know if it's gone up in price, but it's usually like right around $100 or $119 or something. And a lot of times you can get a discount coupon. But I use that with my large cutting mat, the 24 by 36, my 6 by 24 inch ruler, and I use the 45 millimeter rotary cutter. Yeah. And just have some extra blades, because when you start, you know, you want to make sure you have the blades real handy. And that's basically it, you know, a couple of pairs of little snips for next to your sewing machine. Very good. And also on your cutting table.
I've got so many things around me. I probably can just start pulling them up here as you mentioned them.
Basically it, yeah.
Just want to point out a video that we do have on National Quilter Circle, because you mentioned, you know, having your table at the right height, and you know that's not always something that you can, I guess, be super picky about. You know, if there's only a couple tables that you can buy, you know, maybe you're really tall or really short. But we do have a video that sort of shows you ways that you can go around that, how you can adjust the height of your table, and really just kind of talks about sort of the ergonomics of quilting and how to make it a little bit easier on yourself, especially if you're someone who's going to spend hours a day, you know, at your sewing machine. You want to make sure that you're comfortable while doing it. So we do have that video. And then just to wrap it up, because we're almost at the end here, I wanted to remind everybody, we talked about it at the very beginning, but we are doing our 12 days of paper piecing table runner project, and that is foundation paper piecing, which Susan gave some great tips on, so now you know how to do that. So you can check out our website for that, and also the Facebook page, and post some pictures of that, and you'll have some fun holiday sewing to do. So I hope you check it out, and I hope you check it out as well, Susan, and you do some.
Yeah, I will check it out. It sounds like a fun project.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. So I hope you have a wonderful Christmas, and I hope everybody watching does as well, and a wonderful New Year as well. And we'll see you all back here next year.
Yes, happy holidays, everyone.